Hello.
Anyway, if you do want to go and you need a lift, and you're out.
Hi, Rosemary. Now that Rosemary and I have had our normal greeting to each other, this poor bloke here sent me an email. Eric, did you bring him along last week? Yeah, Eric brought him along last week. And he said, I wonder if you could put me on your mailing list. I've just come back to Christchurch and I'm doing this, that and the other thing.
We've got some music playing in the background.
Turn your hearing aid off. Yeah, that's all right, Gerard. It's all right, Gerard. There's a man rushing to console you all. Yeah. That's good. You can see they're just nobody here, Tom, knows their place. What happened was Forest and Bird was supposed to come, I think, 1, 2, and it was supposed to be this week again, and they shifted it to next week, and I had this empty hole, and I thought, oh no, what do? And this wonderful man. Thank you for Gerard. Would you like to thank Aaron for turning the sound off so you could hear?
Gary, it was your last on Aaron that I'm grateful.
Yeah.
Through the speaker.
Yeah. Through. Yeah. So when I found out what Tom's driver was, it is something that's really important for us as a society to get our heads around. And I remember one of the times that Jan Wright spoke here, and she talked about the fact that our railways in New Zealand are down by the sea, mostly. And we've got some major issues. And so to have somebody that's fresh from thinking about this, it's great to have you here, Tom. And thank you for volunteering to come.
Gary, before we start, can you tell them about the van?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yes, there's a white van out the front with their lights on. Well, put it this way, if it's somebody here that's been pretty quiet about it, and if we notice somebody slipping out, we'll stop and point it out. So, Tom Logan, welcome.
All right, yeah, thank you. I was kind of hoping for a couple of weeks to settle in, but here I am. I was at last week, 2 weeks ago, I came along to Glenn Curry's talk and was pitched right in the very back corner. But Glenn actually was a lecturer of mine 10 years ago, and his jokes haven't got any better. But, so yeah, I grew up in the Hawke's Bay, and before moving down to Christchurch in 2010, so I was studying civil engineering for the 4 years of the earthquakes. And I think that was a really good experience, and I guess while studying, one of the questions that I kept having was, what is the engineer's role in society? Are we just meant to essentially, I guess, build the roads or implement the solutions that other people have come up with? And in the roading context at the time, that was of course Jerry Brownlee making decisions.
He's not even a good builder.
So yeah, I guess that wants the driver to decide to do a PhD and head abroad. So I ended up going to Johns Hopkins University, where I thought I was going to do my PhD in environmental engineering, but of course my advisor decided to move after a year, and I ended up following him to the University of Michigan and doing a PhD in industrial and operations engineering. So I have a PhD essentially in risk analysis and combined, primarily focused on urban planning. what are the risks to urban planning? Because the changes in the built environment have allowed us over the years to challenge a lot of public health questions. Essentially, the built environment has had a large effect on the climate crisis that we're now in, and it will have a large influence on how we can both reduce climate change but also mitigate our exposure to natural hazards. But like I said, I have a PhD in risk science, and it keeps me awake at night thinking about the risks that we face. And that was why I came back to New Zealand, because I don't think that we're having the conversation. I don't think we're having the conversation anywhere in the world about what we're actually going to do about climate change. But it became time to come home and try my best to start the conversation here. And especially, like, we've obviously started at least talking about mitigating climate change, but we haven't started really making an effort in terms of adapting. And so what climate scientists often talk about is this idea of managing the unavoidable. And what they mean by that is essentially managing the changes that we've locked in, because we've already exceeded 1 degree average global warming, and we're currently on track for a heck of a lot more. So we need to figure out what we're going to do about it. And the other side of that coin is avoid the unmanageable. So the saying is manage the unavoidable and avoid the unmanageable. And so the reason, like I said, I came back home because partially because I came back in January. Does anyone know where Hamoana is?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's right down the road from my house. And I didn't realize that.
It's called Moana for a reason.
Right, well, it's
Wow.
But when I came back, half of those houses were gone. Well, sorry, they weren't gone. They were gutted. They were destroyed. The like walls that they put in just haven't done what they'd hoped they would. And I think for me, I came back and I visited Granity and Hector on the west coast, and then to go back home to the Hawke's Bay and see that this is happening. That kind of, it's not just something happening on the other side of the world anymore. So my position now, I've come back as a lecturer in civil systems engineering at the University of Canterbury, which as of 3 weeks ago, literally I got off a plane from the US about 2.5 weeks ago. And that position didn't exist before I showed up in the office. And what that means, what systems is, like everyone works in a system. The structural engineers, they have their system. The wetlands engineers, they have their system. But systems engineering is really stepping back and figuring out how all of these sort of fit together. And figuring out how it all fits together especially when we start talking about climate change. And that's what I'm really interested in. So what I really wanted to think about and talk about today was that climate change really, we have to start having this conversation. But more than that, it needs to be in every conversation. And for example, Wellington recently is currently updating its 10-year plan, and they commissioned a report by Becker, and they had 5 different sort of land scenarios that they wanted to consider. The first was more downtown densification. The second was just baseline development. Third was sort of hub and spoke, so lots of little dense neighborhoods. The fourth was greenfield development, and the last one was natural hazards. I wish we could just choose when natural hazards came in and out of the equation. And so that kind of surprised me, because it should be part of everything. And it's not at the moment. So last week I was at the climate mayoral debate that Generation Zero put on, and good on them, it was fantastic to start again to bring that to the front. But they started off the discussion by asking by posing the question, if you could stop the Christchurch earthquake, wouldn't you? And I think that's fantastic, but unfortunately, I think we need to. I'm going to agree with the National Party in this instance, when they say that we're such a small player that we don't really have much of an effect. I disagree with them when they say therefore we shouldn't do anything, because we could be a world leader obviously and apply changes to our economy and export them to the rest of the world. But they're right. We have to play in the sandbox that other people give us, the big emitters give us. And that means that we have to manage the unavoidable. And so the question really is not, what would you do to avoid the earthquake? The question is, there is a massive earthquake on its way. What are you going to do about it? And what are you going to do to protect us and our communities and save lives? So, like I said, we need to inject this into every conversation. It shouldn't be the sideline conversation, but really, how do we design buildings given that we're going to see this change? How are we going to, what flooding are we going to experience in 10, 20, 30 years? And what are we going to do about it? Because the recent local government report came out saying that we have $3 to $14 billion worth of public infrastructure that is at risk from sea level rise. Napier and Nelson both finished or are in the process of renovating their airports that are right next to the coast, $20 and $32 million pop each. And we just seem to choose whether and when to think about the climate and what's changing. So what are we talking about? At the moment, we've currently locked in just under 1.5 degrees of warming globally. And there was a recent report that showed that this isn't spread out equally across the world. But it certainly shows that we're not heading in the right direction. What that means in Christchurch, for example, this is us with zero, unfortunately just chopped off here are the different temperatures. So this is 0 degrees warming, this is 0.5, this is 1, and so you're starting to see just a little bit of inundation along in the east. But we've already exceeded 1 degree, and obviously to get back down we've got a lot of work to do. I think I read in the news the other day that they said we need to triple our emission reduction efforts if we're going to meet the...
Triple nothing.
Right, well, that's the problem. But then, so that's 1. And getting up from 1 to 1.5, you're still seeing more, and that's what 1.5 is our current target. But what we're really on track for is currently our emissions are sitting up at a lot worse. So essentially, well, 1.5 degree. So this is showing a 4 degree rise at about 2,100, where this is 1.5, this is 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, and 4, and that's just 4 degrees. But then, I should say that's not coming within, the warming is not, the sea level rise doesn't immediately follow the warming. So within 25 years, we're only expecting about 30 centimeters. But when I say only, this is when I'm going to start talking about adaptation. Sea level rise is not just about sea level rise. And what we end up with is that 30 meters sea level rise in Christchurch means that what we would consider a 1% flood, so a flood that occurs on average, or the probability of having a flood is 1% of that magnitude. 30 centimeter sea level rise will make that an annual event. So it'll probably happen once a year. In addition to that, we have the storms, coastal erosion, tsunami, and obviously very close to our hearts, increased liquefaction from a higher groundwater table. So that's what we're thinking about in 25 years. And but in theory, if we can meet the Paris Agreement, we can push that out at least a little bit further. But so what does that mean? And this is the whole point: is we need to start talking about what we're going to do. And the sooner we start talking about this, the less it becomes a big deal, and the more it's just something that we've dealt with. And it's not essentially it's. So he's saying, according to this report, climate change may cause serious flooding. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And so I suggest that maybe that's not the approach that we want. One of the nice things about climate change, though, is that it is increasing the rate of serious events. And let me clarify what I mean by that, is that this is increasing the salience of events. And there's a really great paper that came out in Nature Climate Change a few years ago, it's not my own, that was talking about
I'll just bring it back.
Just stay there.
Sorry, I did try.
That's, I think, the last slide there.
Oh.
One of the last. So, by increasing these events, it increases the salience. It increases our awareness of them. And I quote this paper, and it says, events that raise the salience of events will make people and governments more likely to pay attention, more likely to act, and more likely to demand action. The caveat, however, is that is regardless of whether such actions actually reduce risk. And this is why we need to start having the conversation today, not the day after. Why we need to share an idea happen today for communities that we know that are going to be at risk. We know that places along the coast and places that, and not just along the coast, will eventually need to move. But it doesn't mean that they have to be thrown into greenfield development in the middle of nowhere. It means that we can move them slowly and sort of manage that in a way that essentially works with the community at their pace. But only if we start having that conversation. So what this paper was talking about is also this idea of maladaptation, and that's part of where my research lies, is this idea that you can actually take action that makes matters worse for the communities. For example, they look at both wildfires, flooding, and infectious diseases. But in terms of flooding, they're saying that building levees and seawalls is actually just a distraction. And not only that, it encourages development in behind. Because people feel that they're safe, rather than starting to say, well, maybe it's time. And I'm not saying we shouldn't use seawalls, because they do give us a bit more time to think about it. But it shouldn't be it should be part of the suite of tools. Wildfire is also another one, that this idea of controlled burns is essentially just, again, encouraging people to live in this forest urban periphery that is at risk. And the whole point, I think, engineering is starting to realize, as our entire community is that it's not a fight against nature. Civil engineering is not this battle against nature. And now we really have to figure out how to do that properly. So I'm not going to, unfortunately, I'm sorry, I don't have all the answers. Instead, we need to start, and the fact is, and this is what blows my mind a little bit, is that do we not have the answers globally, we're not asking the questions.
Yeah.
Great.
So, yeah, well, and thank God
Just today,
that,
right today, she said exactly that.
right, and it's so fantastic. Honestly, I don't know why I didn't strike from school 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But I want to throw a couple of questions at you. The first is this idea of insurance. And at the moment, we seem to just be letting insurance companies do their thing. And those of you that have seen in premium spikes with earthquakes, wait until they hear about sea level rise and all of those things. But the problem with letting insurance just dictate to us our urban planning is that if they increase insurance in some places, the wealthy people can move out. If ACC takes away its coverage, not ACC, EQC, takes away its coverage, the wealthy people can leave, but the prices just drop, and not only do poor people stay there, but they'll also move there because they just don't have other options. So it means that we're allowing, without oversight, insurance, while it could be a useful tool, we're currently letting insurance companies that have been encouraging us to develop in these places simply walk away. The next is, how do we start having the conversation with, so that our response isn't just ad hoc? How do we approach a community and begin what should be a very long-term conversation, where we present the uncertainty? Like, we don't know what is going to happen or when, but we do know that at some stage they'll probably need to move, or we'll need to do something. And so that's kind of what Christchurch's Share an Idea is like. Is an awesome option, and that kind of goes down to my point of managed retreat. Because if we have to retreat, ideally it's going to be managed. Also, and I could have stood on a soapbox for hours and talked about dense living and cycleways, and I've decided not to this time. But greenfield development is just like, that's what we get when we have this ad hoc response. We just push people out into the middle of nowhere, and when we end up with $3 per litre petrol because so-and-so blows out Saudi, we again leave poor people and those without the means unable to access their jobs, their schools, and so figuring out, like, I don't know why we just tossed a bunch of people in the middle of nowhere and then complain that our public transport system is terrible. And it's not enough, I think, it's not enough for the mayors to just complain that ECAN runs the bus system, because they have, well, yes, anyway.
Say it.
You're with friends.
Well, no, I was thinking, one of the things I really liked about Glenn's talk 2 weeks ago, and I don't think he emphasized the point enough, was that the solution to the transport problem was in fact not a transport solution.
Yeah.
And that's so often the case with the solution to coastal hazards is not a coastal engineer's in the coastal engineer's expertise. And so all of these problems, we need to start having a more interdisciplinary system, and with a risk of sounding cliche, a systems approach to thinking about it. And the last thing is this idea of tech fix distractions. And one of the mayoral candidates said, well, no, I'm not going to do that. Daryl Park said, we'll have hydrogen buses. Oh my God. 20 years ago, we were going to have hydrogen cars just like 2 years later, and that would just allow us to keep living the same lives, consume the same things, and just substitute it in. We've not seen that happen. And so that's why I think, but unfortunately, that means that we need to have a longer term discussion about how we're changing the built environment so that we don't need to be consuming as much, so that we can be healthier, actually live nearer our friends and the places that we want to go. And I would, but that again is another, could be a much longer discussion. So, having come back to Christchurch, one of the reasons I came back, as I said, was because I wanted to start having a New Zealand focus. But to do that, I need to figure out, and what I was hoping to spend a few weeks doing, but obviously got dragged in without too much time, was to really figure out what those problems were and start having discussions with the communities. And that's where I'm going. So those of you that have those connections, I'd love to talk to you. One other thing that I'm interested in getting your input is, and the other reason I came back was that the university set up a compulsory course for third-year civil engineers called Sustainable Engineering in a Changing Climate. And so I'm leading that course next year. And what I think I'm going to do with it is say, by the end of this course, I want you in groups based on your geographic origin to come up, to outline a plan to make your regional council, whatever it is, carbon neutral, and have it figure out how they're going to adapt and prepare for climate change. I have no idea what that looks like. The council has no idea what that looks like, but someone has to figure it out, so I figure that 200 plus civil engineers might have a good crack at it. So we'll see how it goes. But like I said, if you have any thoughts or ideas, I'd love to hear from you. So with that, thank you very much.
Very good.
Thank you, Tom. That was great. Right. Well, there's lots of questions. What about the old engineers?
Thanks very much. That's great talk there, Tom. I have to say I was a bit gobsmacked a week or two ago when I read that Christchurch has got the problem, solved the problem of where to put all its cemeteries and some other activities because they own several hundred hectares of wonderful land in the Templeton area, and it looks like here's a great space. Now, my understanding is that Templeton soils are supposedly some of the best food growing kind of soils in the country, prime versatile soils, and I'm thinking, who is making these decisions? Who's not having the conversations that you're talking about in terms of green fields and stuff, and condensing population densities and avoiding and making sure that we keep our best soils for future food production and other productive purposes, instead of having to pour heaps of fertilizer and water onto less valuable soils. Anyway, I just thought I'd mention that because I saw in your last sort of slide, it seemed rather relevant.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess the food is something that I'm also really interested in. Like, how do we feed our cities and going forward if we end up if the climate is affecting our food systems, or especially our trade routes. And the university has this new research initiative that's kind of starting to look at this. But I think figuring out basically we need a thorough risk analysis for where what will affect our food production, not to mention our food logistics and everything else. And then ideally, as you say, linking that in with just stopping developing in those areas, which ideally would be part of a broader strategy. But one of the questions that I've kind of been pondering is, how do we I feel like fresh food is already expensive, but it's not valued enough. So how do we say that, especially vegetarian food, how do we say this is essential for life, but also we need to make it affordable for everyone, but also we need to pay the people that are making it appropriately, and that's another conversation.
Yes, about 6 weeks or 2 months ago, the Guardian Weekly had a photograph of a tree on the front cover, and scrawled across it was, "This machine kills CO2." Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I saw the.
I saw that. What's yours? And the long-form article inside the magazine presented quite a lot of research about the fact that 1 trillion trees would actually be the silver bullet that cured our CO2 problem. Have you read that research, and what's your response to that, please?
I skimmed the article. I didn't read the background research, and I guess my take would be that planting trees has to be part of the solution, but again, is when I guess my initial sort of gut reaction is somewhat hesitant when we talk about silver bullets. I maintain that
You haven't read the research. You didn't read the article.
I haven't read the scientific
I
article.
suggest you read the article.
And
It was quite impressive.
There is no
but
Read the article.
no, actually, I think I'll push back a little bit. I don't think that we can do. There's any one thing we can do and continue to drive and continue to consume in the way that we do. And my understanding of what science does in those articles, regardless of how they're picked up in the media, is that these things are figuring out more tools to add to our toolbox, but it's not going to solve the problem on its own. But I'll definitely check it out.
Hang on.
Oh, no. Sorry.
I don't
No,
want
just a comment, not a question.
I don't want to stop the flow of the conversation. That was a great talk, Tom. In the UK, we have environmental impact assessments for every single development, and that includes climate change, understanding the impact, but then also putting in place mitigation and adaptation. Is that something that happens in New Zealand? And if not, how do we make that government policy so that every development has to have that?
So in the US, they also have to receive FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency funding, you also have to have an adaptation plan, but we don't have that, to my knowledge, in New Zealand. And that is something that I'm starting to I'm interested in comparing what our regulatory system is compared to, especially the US, where you would think that the US is behind New Zealand, but I think in adaptation it's actually ahead. Mainly because my take is that the municipalities in the US haven't been looking to federal leadership, so they've taken the initiative themselves.
There is no federal.
It's highly variable.
Right.
It's very highly variable.
Right. Some places are doing really well, and others is not.
Absolutely.
But in New Zealand, we've kind of split. We've said that the central government is responsible for mitigation, and the local government is responsible for adaptation. But I think, and I'm hoping that the changes that have gone through recently is a sign that central government is going to start backing up local government in doing it. But that's a question that I'm sure.
Thanks, Tom. My mind goes back about 5 or 6 years when we were asked, I just think about the nonsense around, we were asked to do a plan for South Shore here at Brighton, and I said, well, we'll factor in climate change. No, I'm not allowed to do that. I said, well, we're not doing the plan, that's a nonsense. Anyway, moving on. We've done some work recently on the whole pine thing, the billion trees and all the pine, and we've been able to show that there will be zero sequestration from the pine cropping, because the cropping and the logs are going offshore and being made into short-term products with an average life about 4 years, and that means that for every crop we would have to double the area of New Zealand that is in pines, and we can't do that. So I can send you the article. We've got some good science on this. But what I'd like to do, we're now doing farm plans, integrated farm plans, to help farmers, show how they can be carbon neutral. What would it take to transition to carbon neutral? So maybe we can team up with your bunch of students to work through that. Yeah, so I haven't got a question. I'll say, are you interested?
Yeah.
Diana.
Absolutely.
Diana.
And in fact, one of the things, just following on from that, one of the things that I was up in North Canterbury recently, I think I wrote something about this in the Tuesday Club notes, and I was talking to a farmer up there, and he said, we want people to be talking to us. And in fact, that's something that maybe we can encourage to happen, so that we actually talk to each other. I think Rosemary's pushed that a few times.
Absolutely.
And then it's not a them and us, because he said they're just as concerned about nitrates getting into the water, into our aquifer, as we are. And so, he's, this guy's, I think he's 5th generation farmer or something up there. So, it's something we should encourage maybe through your work, Di.
Yeah, happy to.
Yeah.
And I'm showing dairy farmers how they can get right, so there's no nitrate problem, and that they can be carbon neutral and still have, hundreds of dairy cows.
Excellent. So that sounds like a half the class. Right. Questions? Oh, sorry.
No, sorry, no.
Oh, no.
Just a comment.
Your comment will be perfect. I can tell.
Just commenting on the Greta and George Monbiot video clip that was there. To me, it was very clever, because what it was saying was, this was about the tree as a magic carbon sequestration thing. And yes, it's probably pushing the argument too far, but it's something anyone can do anywhere on the planet, anytime.
Yes.
It's the low-hanging fruit of solutions. That's why they chose it, and that's why they've emphasised it in very simple terms. So, I a year and a half ago, I was living in Australia. They're bulldozing hundreds of hectares of bush every day. They're going crazy. The developers just destroying the whole bush area, and the opposite is what we need. Actually, we start building forests, not so much for crops, because crops, of course, the carbon gets cycled back, it's temporarily held, but to actually reforest large parts of the thing that were turned into agriculture and were ever marginal. And it's almost like the old days with old de Muldoon, when they had to walk off the Mackenzie country because it wasn't sustainable. That's the same issue.
Thank you. Lynn.
Thanks, Tom. I teach at Lincoln, and also opportunities for collaboration there. But I was remembering when you're talking about conversations, and hopefully from that collaborative plans. 2 of my students have done are from Nepal and have done their theses on the Nepalese approach, which is local area plans of action. And every region, every village has their own local area plan of action to adapt to climate change. And every time I learn more about what they're doing, I think how far behind we are. I mean, obviously they're getting a lot of international aid support to help them through that process. But it starts with a local sort of workshops in a local region, and then they together look at what has happened, what changes have happened in the past, how can they live, what can they do differently in the future. I mean, there were some shortcomings we worked out in terms of they didn't necessarily get the access to the science input that could have helped, but it was recognising the local knowledge. And they are facing some sort of wide range of effects, like things that were previously grown at 100 metres or 1,000 metres are now being grown at 8,000 metres because the climate has moved up the mountain. And so they're having to face a lot of changes of crops, a lot of changes of population distribution, migration out and all sorts of things. So, but they do seem to have a mechanism for getting together as a community and working out what to do.
That's right. Thanks, Phil. You want to respond to that or not?
No.
I think there's 200 students, you might need 400 by the time.
Tom, thanks for a good talk. I was just wondering, what, if you had a response or other people in the room might, about what do we do collectively about flying in aeroplanes. Like apparently this Trump meeting that he's convening and Jacinda's attending and things, people have been arriving in their private jets by the dozen or by the 10. So it's a meeting about climate change and they're arriving in private jets. So I just can't work it out. Well, I haven't thought deeply about it, but I do know people that are declining to fly now, even locally, let alone internationally. But what do you or people feel about that?
I guess
Somebody's going to respond to that.
I just have just one word came to my head. Just one word came to my head. It was trains, especially in New Zealand. Just invest in some good transport.
What are they?
Inland trains.
Just a wee addition to what Patrick said. Patrick's cousin. Better looking. Evidently, our number one industry is tourism. Of course, that relies on the aeroplane. Evidently, none of the cost of that and carbon is taken into any equations in the profit we're making. There's no fuel tax.
So, I guess again, two obviously very big issues. In my initial response, one of the things when we talk about climate mitigation, I think it's funny that we're often expected to make individual sacrifices for, which I think we do, and I've been saying we need to consume less, but I think it's interesting when the conversation is about us recycling and turning off the light, when there are like huge changes that we could make with system, like institutional changes or companies making changes. And I worked at a Silicon Valley company last year, and every lunchtime they brought out huge platters of meat and they were tossed out afterwards. I'm like, well, why have I been a vegan for the past 2 years? And I guess but in terms of flying, yes, I agree that we should, for short trips, where especially in the US, you can, it doesn't, I got flown from Baltimore to Philly, which is a half-hour drive. And it was just crazy. But it was because I was taking a flight further out. But the hub system with the airlines were we're going to jump you here first. Incidentally, I missed the second flight because of the delay with the half-hour one. But so that network of trains within, especially within 100 miles or whatever it is, that I think would be fantastic. And I'd love to take an overnight train to Wellington or whatever. But then I guess just we need to figure out whether it's biofuels or simply not traveling where we can conference. But I feel like those answers are not particularly insightful. But I go back to saying I think that there are major structural changes that we can make in our institutions and in our companies that mean that we're not having to, that the decisions that we make to be more sustainable aren't so such a sacrifice. I've decided I don't want a car in Christchurch, and that makes life so much more difficult. And it shouldn't be like that. Making those choices shouldn't be so much harder.
You're probably not expecting this one, Tom, because I just thought of it, but I want to come back to the question about how we initiate conversations, because you're just starting out as a lecturer wanting to initiate conversations. I was a fairly young lecturer when we were starting to talk about climate change, and now I'm retired. And we're 30 years on, and we really don't seem to have got terribly far. It's not part of the conversation
with respect to local body elections at the moment, as far as I can make out. It doesn't really feature at a national level in the prominent sort of way that Jacinda promised us it might have done a couple of years ago. And I wonder if this has something to do with how we actually frame up these conversations, because a lot of our solutions are voluntaristic or they're institutional, but that makes me wonder, how do you actually persuade people to participate in something which is voluntary or led by policy? Because a lot of climate change stuff over the last 30 years has been framed in terms of a scientific problem, which gives most people the obvious out. We don't believe it, okay, or we can ignore it because we don't understand it. And now it seems to me we're reframing it as a technical problem, and we're saying, all right, we'll all buy an electric car, we'll go on an electric bus, or we'll build a windmill, and everything will be all right, which gives us another out. So as you say, we can just carry on doing what we were doing previously. There is some sort of interesting writing emerging at the moment. I'd just be interested to know what people think about this, what you think about this. If we reframed climate change as a moral problem and said that it is actually wrong what we're doing at the moment in terms of foreclosing the opportunities for future generations, it's wrong that one species should be in such a position that it can terminate the life chances of many other species. It's wrong that we actually do to the one and only home that we've got what we are actually doing. And if we saw this in a moral sense, would this give the conversation a bit more of a shove, or would it in fact just turn people off like they've been turned off by the other ways of framing this? That's a bit of a musing.
What's your answer? Isn't it is the question?
Well, yeah, does anyone else have a response?
Chrissy, did you want to respond?
I've got another question.
I think
I'm thinking that something, what Eric's saying is something that we maybe get a discussion going on this.
Yes, I'd love to know how we actually get these conversations going.
Right, but I think now, one, we're assisted with salience, like we actually have started to see changes, and before it was something that you couldn't see, therefore you could ignore it. But maybe the answer is, instead of choosing just one of those, we talk about it in all three, depending on the situation. Especially like in the Republican South, we can't talk about climate change. So we talk about morals and values and whether you want to see changes. Talking about the changes that we're seeing. We can talk about efficiency and monetary gains, but I'm reminded of in Naomi Klein's book, she commented on the Environmental Defence Fund, who used to have the motto "sue the bastards," and then they started working closely with big tech to find compromises, and obviously that didn't happen. So I think, at least for me, figuring out how to motivate that question and motivate the conversation is starting to, me and I think other young people are starting to realize that we don't actually have time to not have this conversation. So I don't care really if I get fired. A friend of mine said, I'm not counting on my retirement package from where she works because she's going to disrupt. And I'm going to disrupt, and if enough other people continue to make noise until we see something happening, hopefully we will.
My point is just a sort of continuation on that, is because your subject next year, you're going to be teaching 200 students that are taking a compulsory course in environmental impact. My sort of question is, how much of that is teaching technical engineering, and how much of that is sort of selling the idea or changing their perception to embark on that mission?
Well, it's both. And like a huge part of that course is ethics, because I think that's really important. But I also don't want the course to be considered a fluffy subject, because I don't think that sustainability is less technical or less quantitative than their real subjects. And that's what I'm really worried about. So that's what I'm going to try and avoid. But it also has to include risk, which is by nature semi-quantitative, where it has both qualitative and quantitative aspects. It has to include community engagement and actually like designing for people. And as I said, it has to include that ethics aspect. Like when we build a seawall, we have to consider the effect of people, not just the neighbours who will end up getting more of the water, but future generations that are going to live behind it thinking they're safe. So I feel like I don't feel like I'm not entirely satisfied with my response to that question, but yes, like it needs to be more than just the technical. And it's going to be a different class. Like the way that I'm going to completely change how it's taught. It's not going to be me standing in front of them, except when I jump up and down and try and say like, I really need your guys' help to like save our country. So hopefully that will inspire.
Good stuff.
Well, this is a bit related. We talk about adaptation, but we often fail to distinguish between what is adaptation to continue life as normal and what is real adaptation, which relates to mitigation. So the sort of the distinction between mitigation and adaptation is problematic. And I think within adaptation, as has been mentioned, there's a moral decision around what is real adaptation, and what is adaptation, which means we buy more air conditioners, or we utilise the now available hydrocarbons in the Arctic. So there's a real challenge about distinguishing what's good adaptation, what is crap adaptation. And before I finish, let you respond, just remember Friday, because there's going to be a hell of a leadership going on Friday, and I hope lots of us are going to join in.
That's actually a big conversation in the resilience field at the moment, where resilience is this idea of bouncing back. And the question is, what are we bouncing back to? And the classic sort of example is that poverty is a very resilient system because it's very hard to, if resilience is about returning to your original state, if you're in poverty, it's very hard to leave that state. But in some of my research, I've been looking at how we define the state. Do we measure things as, is the perturbation a change from the baseline, or do we want to start up, say right off the bat, this is where we're at? And so what in the context that I'm thinking is, do we have access to, for example, food? So if we consider food deserts in a city, how do they, instead of just saying like, if you have an earthquake or whatever, you can see that access drop. What we need to do then is put in sort of emergency food supplies. But the other way of looking at it is to say, actually, we aren't in a system that is what we want. Yeah. So even once we've got back to where we were before, that's not where we want to be. And so that, I guess, is going to ideally encourage that push. But it won't unless the decision comes down to how you measure it. And the only way that we can encourage people to measure it to constantly improve is, as you've said, ethics and morals. And that was when the Silicon Valley story, I actually got fired from that company because I raised a couple of ethical concerns, and that was one of them, was the way that we're measuring resilience and selling it to these companies is not helping the vulnerable people.
Badge of honour.
I dodged the bullet, I think. I get to be back here. So.
We're thrilled you got sacked.
You just need another 2 times to become a complete man.
Well, We're on track, I think.
Thanks, Gary, and Tom and I plan to catch up sometime, so it's Chrissy. And just there's some people in the city that are thinking a lot about adaptation, and particularly around adaptation to coastal hazards and sea level rise. And I think it's really worth thinking about equity in this, because it's not equitable and it does become a moral discussion. So we've had the biggest example of retreat in Christchurch with the 7,000 plus people who were red zoned. We know how inequitable that was. Some people did well out of it, some others didn't do very well out of it. Some people were red zoned who didn't want to be, some people weren't red zoned who did want to be. So that's an example, and it means there's now a presumption in Christchurch that the government will save us. Today I've been looking at compensation mechanisms for people who may have to retreat. And if you think about retreat, the inequities, you've got people who live by the coast, people who don't live by the coast. You've got people who've lived by the coast for the last 30 years not knowing the risks, and people who've moved there recently who do know the risks. You've got a real difference if you look at, let's choose Auckland, Omaha and Sandspit, where you've got multi-million dollar houses by the coast, and you've got people living, say, at Selwyn huts and very modest housing. So if you're going to have some kind of equity about compensating people if they have to move from the coast, how do you do that when you've got multi-million dollar houses compared with $30,000 houses? I don't know how you do it. And so it's easy to say let's get communities living by the coast talking about adaptation, but it's bloody hard, and you've got to be honest with them. But the honesty is really hard for them because it's their total investment, it's their what they're handing on to their kids. They don't know when it's going to happen to them. A lot of the retreat we'll probably have in Christchurch won't be planned retreat, it'll be chaotic retreat when we have a big event. So I think those of us who don't live by the coast need to have some empathy for the people that do, especially the people who've lived there a long time. I moved from South Brighton myself 4 years ago. The easterly was one of the biggest deciders for me, but sea level rise was also another. So I don't know whether you've got a comment about that, Tom, about the equity and the moral hazard that people build knowing that they're going to be hopefully going to be compensated, so they invest when they know there's a risk. So
yeah, I think that's the equity issue is something that I'm very well aware of, and think that it's a huge question, and the only way that we can one of the ways that we can make sure, or try best to make sure it is equitable, is to have these start the conversations now and have them long term. But yeah, we I think that a major issue is that with how we're planning to fund these changes, if we've set a precedent with the red zone in one part of the country, but then in others completely different. It's this piecemeal approach, and there are so many houses along the coast. I think that we would be wise to start having that conversation soon, and especially have that conversation before we let insurance companies make a buck out of poor people.
And it's not just the coast, it's the rivers. I mean, the city council's already paid out people in Heathcote River.
People on slopes.
Flockton Basin. Right. I said to somebody up the back, this guy's going to be a phenomenal lecturer.
Yeah.
And he said he's going to be more than that.
Yeah.
And I'm delighted that you were sacked. But look, one of the things I think that you can hear this is a group that's really engaged in the city and engaged in thinking. And one of the things that would be quite good for us to do would be to bring some of the council planners here, and maybe let's sort of workshop it and the theatre of having you and your students with the council planners, both ECAN and City Council, because I know a lot of those planners are just as interested as you are in a lot of these topics, and they're squashed often by the system. So we could start off there, so your students, you can be working on what you want them to cover, And then I think we need to, I wrote this week about the juries, you know, the selecting juries. People and citizens juries. And I think that picks up what Chrissy was talking about those of us that aren't on the coastline, but when I look at that, we will eventually be.
You're on the beach, Gary.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, my house is, I need an oxygen cylinder, it's so bloody high now. But what we need to do is we need to actually, we're interested in discourses here. We're interested in deep investment in ideas. And maybe something that we can work with you, with your students, and bring the city in and the regional council, and then start thinking about how do we, like, these students shouldn't see it as an academic exercise, isolated from reality. Let them smell the breath of people that are affected by what they're playing with. And I think that would be a really, really good exercise, and I think our city would benefit hugely from it. So I really loved what you said, and you had a real good Kiwi way of doing it where you are doing. I'm not sure how I'm going to go. It was absolutely bloody brilliant. Thank you.
He will buy you a beer.
And next week we've got Forrest and Bird who are here, and I can't remember the topic, but they're bringing some speaker from out of town talking about water in Canterbury. And they're talking about, I think it's the act that Parker's talking about, but I'm not sure. So anyway, they'll be here next week. And just to, Tom, you need to come in a few weeks because we've got the Chief Executive of the Insurance Council coming. So.